we're talking about Christianity, the way that Christendom contracted, expanded, and divided between 500 and about 1300 current era. Before we get into the meat of the lesson, I want to talk a little bit about background or intro. When we're talking about Christendom, experienced a pretty large Afro-Eurasian reach with these flourishing communities in Arabia, Egypt, North Africa, Ethiopia, Nubia, Syria, Armenia, Persia, India, China, and Europe for the 500s and 600s in the current era. Christianity was huge. There's going to be some pretty radical changes over the next millennium. A lot of those changes are going to be due to the creation and growth of the Islamic religion and later the Islamic Empire. So Christianity is going to become largely a European religion with pockets that are going to be maintained in other areas. And part of the reason why Christianity is going to thrive in Europe and not so much in other areas is that it allows for a cultural commonality in Europe, like Buddhism or Confucianism in China or the Islamic faith in North Africa and the Middle East. Christianity is, however, also going to experience changes within itself. In Eastern Europe, you have the eastern half of the former Roman Empire, Byzantium, where Christianity is going to fall under the umbrella of the empire and develop largely tied to the state. In Western Europe, in the Latin part of the world, where the western part of Rome had fallen apart, there's a bit of a vacuum. There's no large empire to control. So Christianity there is going to develop in a rather disconnected, largely localized society, but yet Christianity is going to maintain a commonality there that draws in aspects of the Celts from the north, the Italian peninsula, that whole kind of Western European area. And the church develops outside of political association and kind of becomes both a unifying factor and a power within itself in that area. So we'll start with looking at the Asian kind of variety of Christianity. As Islam spreads through the Middle East, a lot of Jewish and Christian communities are going to feel the impact of that spreading. By the time the Muslim forces take control of Jerusalem, they are going to kind of absorb and yet control a lot of the religious artifacts and area sites within the Holy City. A big example of this would be the Dome of the Rock. As the Islamic shrine known as the Dome of the Rock is built, that specific location had long been regarded as sacred. To the Jews, it contained the stone in which Abraham had prepared to offer his son Isaac as a sacrifice. It had been the site of two Jewish temples. To the Christians, this was a place where a young Jesus had come to study and later drive out the money changers. So when the Umayyad Caliph, the successor, orders a new construction in that site, what he's doing is he's appropriating for Islam both former Jewish and Christian legacies, but he's also demonstrating the power Islam has over the other two physically. You start to see in areas like Syria and Persia more concentrated populations of Christians generally being treated with accommodation, not this forced version. In both areas, though, the majority of people are going to turn to Islam voluntarily, possibly because of its success, them living a better life. It's not that different from your religion. The tenets are largely the same. So you originally convert for economic reasons, and then maybe a few generations later, it's become more of a religious attachment. It's also possible that these areas you've got people who are allowed to relatively practice the religions of Christianity and Judaism freely, except for paying a special tax. A lot of this really kind of depends on the attitude of the local Muslim ruler. Some occasions churches are still destroyed. You still have the plundering and the burning and the wearing of distinctive clothing and stuff to draw yourself out and draw attention to you. But in other areas, Syria specifically, Christians are treated with respect and they're recruited into administrations, armed forces even. A lot of them start to also, in self-preservation, abandon their religious paintings and idolatries that represent the divine. It comes to, they're left largely unmolested during the Tang dynasty, but because they're absorbing Buddhist and Taoist concepts, see examples of this as Jesus being called Jesus Sutra. Describe God as the cool wind, sin as bad karma. So you see this real Nestorian Christianity in China kind of really blending those concepts of Buddhism and Confucianism and Christianity together. In the book on page 467 has a stele where this large limestone block, and it shows a picture of how Christianity in China, you have this very kind of Taoist symbol. The contraction of Christianity in Asia really doesn't happen much because of Islam, but largely from Chinese politics. As the Chinese state in the mid-800s turned against anything foreign, the Nestorian Christianity there is really dependent on the goodwill of the government. It starts to kind of wither. When the Mongols come and conquered China, the Nestorian Christians kind of get a little bit of a revival for a little while, but remember, Mongol control doesn't last very long. After a short revival, the return of Confucian dynasty is going to pretty much wipe out, not completely, but almost completely wipe out the Christian communities. When it comes to the contraction of Christianity in Africa, we're going to look first at Egypt. Remember, Egypt developed their own interpretations of the life of Jesus and their own language called Coptic for worship. As the Islamic Empire expands and absorbs into Egypt, at first, the Christian population, which was the dominant population, is able to freely kind of worship as those kind of second-class citizens that are protected by paying that tax as dhimmis. But the thing that's interesting to note is that the relatively tolerant Arabic rulers were preferred to their Byzantine previous rulers, which seems kind of strange because you're like, aren't the Byzantines Christian? Yes, that's true, but to the Greek Orthodox Byzantium rulers, the Coptic Christians of Egypt are seen as heretics. The Arabic rulers left them relatively in peace. Still, however, until the mid-1300s when you've got the Crusades going and Mongol invasions, and at that point things start to kind of change, and a lot of the Coptic Christians of Egypt start to convert for, well, safety reasons. When it comes to Nubia, farther south, Christianity flourished for several hundred years. A lot of political leaders had also held religious offices, but by about 1500s, there's a lot of pressure from Egypt, who at that point was Arabic. There's a lot of local conversions that are happening for economic reasons and a lot of Arab migrations to the area. So Christianity really kind of falls out of favor here. What's interesting about the story of Africa and Christianity is a lot of it does eventually wind up Islamic, except for Ethiopia. Ethiopia is the exception. It's often referred to as an island of Christianity in a Muslim sea. Part of this is geographical. Ethiopia is kind of up in the highlands and in the mountains, so there's physical difference from it in other places. And also its distance from the Islamic centers of power are going to be a source of protection. Even today, 60% of the population of Ethiopia is considered Christian. There's also the kind of collective memory that Ethiopia had sheltered several Muslim refugees from Mecca during the Prophet's lifetime. So while Christianity remains in Ethiopia, it's going to kind of develop its own course without contact with the other Christian churches. So they developed this fascination with Judaism and Jerusalem. What's interesting is that the story includes an episode where King Solomon seduces the Queen of Sheba, who is an Ethiopian queen, and they produce a child together who becomes the founding monarch of the Ethiopian state. And since the Solomon is figured in the line of descent to Jesus, it's the idea of this story is kind of Ethiopia's proof for their legitimacy and their position. In the 12th century, they start building this kind of underground series of 12 linked churches. The thought is to attempt to create a new Jerusalem on Christian Ethiopian soil, if the original holy city was under Islamic control. These churches are still in use today.